number 17, update and evaluation of surface water storage. And the vice chair is going to be sitting at the table since this is kind of based on a little document that is attached, which has his name on it. Let's see, should we ask the Vice Chair to identify himself? Mr. Fiorini.
I know how tough you can be on panelists, so I'd ask for your mercy as this panel begins to discuss storage. Randy Fiorini, Vice Chair.
Robert Shibatani, CEO, hydrologist with the Shibatani Group.
Who just testified in Washington, D.C. 1 week ago on this same generic subject of storage to a House committee, subcommittee.
Mario Santoyo, Assistant General Manager, Front Water Authority.
Todd Manley with the Northern California Water Association. I'm Director of Government Relations.
Okay. Mr. Fiorini.
So let me kick this off. In the Delta Plan, there are two recommendations that specifically address storage. WR14, WR15, I believe, are the numbers. Those deal with one, complete the surface project storage studies specific to sites and Temperance Flat and the enlargement of Shasta. And second of all, to do a statewide survey of water agencies to determine what potential projects are out there in the backyards of local water agencies that have been looked at, considered, but have not been pursued for whatever reason. So, since water storage is near and dear to my heart, and I will point out that I grew up and I currently farm in an area that is serviced by a reservoir that is the state's largest locally owned water storage facility in the state of California. And that Don Pedro Reservoir has served our area very, very well. There's adequate water stored to meet most of the driest of year conditions. In most years, it has adequately addressed flood control issues and also provides in-stream flows for the Tuolumne River. So, understanding that storage can be a positive, I wanted to try and help kickstart efforts towards completing the two recommendations in the Delta Plan. Now, initially, this paper began from an encouragement from our chair to focus in on the small storage projects and just describe how that should happen. But I couldn't resist addressing the larger projects that have been under study for 10 years and offer a couple of recommendations about that. So, generally speaking, 13, 14 years ago, under CalFed, the Department of Water Resources was tasked to identify potential storage projects that were out there in support of gaining additional flexibility for the water system, particularly the State Water Project. They looked at primarily large projects. That was their criteria. Large projects that could effectively be used to re-regulate or re-operate the system. So of the 53 projects, potential projects that they looked at, they summarily dismissed a number of them simply because they were under 200,000 acre feet in capacity. Since that time, the department and the Bureau have undertaken studies of initially 5 projects. Now it's down to 3. One of those that was initially looked at was Los Vaqueros. The Contra Costa Water Agency decided not to wait for the state or federal investigations, but took it upon themselves. And in this period of time, they did the studies, They did the construction, they added a second phase, and now they're considering a third phase. This is a local agency in action. At the same time, the studies for Temperance Flat and sites continue to roll along, although not very smoothly, and have yet to be completed for a number of good reasons. So the paper offers 6 recommendations. Number 1, and you'll find this beginning on page 5. Number 1, in keeping with our Delta Plan recommendation, complete the studies, calling on the legislature and the governor to provide adequate resources to get the studies completed and evaluate whether or not these are good projects.
Is it a resource problem?
It has been a financial issue. It has been the lack of, and this goes to the second recommendation, there has been no champion for these projects because of the uncertainty in most cases. There is a need to identify who's going to benefit from these projects before anybody is going to be willing to write a check. It's no different than if we're going out to buy a car. We want to know how it's going to perform, what we're going to get out of it before we write the check. Well, that's an unknown. So my second recommendation is a starting point for a conversation that if you were to do a Temperance Flat or a sites, let the local champion, the regional champion, whoever it is that steps forward and says, we can use water coming out of this project, we think it's a good project, give them 50% of it and dedicate the other 50% for the public trust, for in-stream flows, for temperature control, and so on. It's in my mind, it's a way to address the co-equal goals and to give the water agencies who step forward and say we want to pay for this some certainty. So we're asking the legislature and the governor for this kind of certainty on those projects. The last 4 recommendations deal with this idea that there are a number of local projects, smaller projects that are out there that could be beneficial to help meet the co-equal goals, water supply reliability, regional sustainability, and those measures that we spell out and recommend in the Delta Plan. So number 3, take another look at the CalFed study that was done 13 years ago. Take another look at the 53 locations that were mentioned. Number 4, conduct a statewide survey and add to that list. There are water agencies throughout the state that have local projects that could be done that aren't a part of that list of 53. So expand the list, find out what's out there. And to utilize the Water Commission along with, and I've since added to this draft report, not only participation with the Association of California Water Agencies to assist the Water Commission, but also I'm recommending that 1 or 2 NGOs be involved in this process because there are aspects of storage that are beneficial to fish and fowl, and so I think it's important to have the NGOs a part of this study process or this survey process. Then many times local agencies have not pursued these projects because they're cost prohibitive for limited local value. But if there is a cost share component, either federal or state or both, it may make these projects more doable. So that's recommendation number 5. And then number 6, as we know, permitting can be very, very difficult. So a recommendation to help accelerate the acquisition of permits to move forward on these valuable projects is the 6th recommendation. So I will defer to my colleagues for their comments, suggestions. My hope is that with minimal adjustments to this document, that it will be something that the council would like to approve and that we can begin disseminating it to help generate more discussion regarding above ground and below ground storage. Thank you.
Okay, well, let's see if there are any immediate questions to you, Randy. Nope. Okay. Mr. Shibatani, you're next.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman, members of the council. I want to thank you for the opportunity of appearing before you today. As some of you may be aware, the House Subcommittee on Water and Power held an oversight hearing about a month ago today, October 29th. The title was a a new roadmap for increasing water supply and hydropower supplies across the United States, a new strategy for enhancing and developing increased, flexible, and expanded facilities, multi-purpose facilities for these new yield initiatives. And at the time, subcommittee chairman had asked me to testify on behalf of one specific aspect of that overall general debate on new storage. My focus was on high elevation storage. Talk about some of the benefits of what high elevation storage offers, how it's different than perhaps previous historic water supply projects. Talk about some of the emerging trends in new storage development across the nation, and talk about what our long-term prospects are for using storage projects in the future. Now, I think we're all agreeable that high elevation storage projects are not a new concept here in California. We've been discussing high elevation storage projects for a number of years. I think you can harken back to the most recent Water Commission public workshops that were held fall of 2011, where many CalFed projects, other storage projects, and even high elevation storage projects were brought to the table. For the oversight hearing, we felt very, very strongly that with the emerging interests in new dams and reservoirs across the nation, it is time to elevate the new discussion on new storage as a primary top priority in U.S. domestic water policy. So, Mr. Chairman, just a brief summary of my presentation before the subcommittee members. I started off the discussion by talking about what high elevation storage is, a definition of what it involves, some of the variations and some of the benefits that can accrue to new high elevation storage projects, and then tie that into what our long-term prospects might be and how high elevation storage projects can actually fit into the overall need for where we want to go. So I essentially said that high elevation storage projects involve new upstream impoundments that are above existing facilities. So taking the Central Valley of California as an example, I know that these facilities would be above existing state, federal, local agency impoundments that, as we all know, either ring or circumvent the Central Valley that we operationally define as terminal or rim reservoirs. Now, given their location and the combination with coordinated operations, I know with the subcommittee members that there are a number of distinguishing factors that make these new facilities quite different than perhaps their historic counterparts. Number one, they are at a high elevation, which means they are at the source area for snow accumulation and the potential effects for climatic shiftings that we are now starting to observe in our high elevation watersheds. Number two, they are at remote location, which means many of the population displacement risks that might be typically associated with the new high elevation storage projects are largely reduced relative to those facilities nearer higher population density centers. The corollary to that, of course, is for construction-related effects. I used a surrogate for sensitive receptors, and I noted things such as air quality, noise effects, public utility issues, community disruptions, potentially traffic delays, and indeed land use conflicts, again, are largely marginalized relative to those facilities that might be more closely situated near high population density centers. And the final point is that the distal proximity of these high elevation storage reservoirs relative to their downstream outflow. Think of the Pacific coast. The downstream outflow point is the Pacific Ocean. There are some estuaries, I know the Bay Delta, as well as the interceding reservoirs that exist between these high elevation facilities and the downstream point mean that, in general, many of these high elevation facilities are largely immune or at least somewhat unaffected by existing downstream water quality control objectives, like what we're experiencing in the Bay Delta. Functionally, Mr. Chairman, capturing upstream precipitation in these source areas provide a strong benefit for downstream flood protection. But the distinguishing point here is that we do that at the point source of runoff generation. Dams provide that attenuation capability for upstream flood peak runoff. We do that in a multi-purpose facet, and we do that as the first line defense. The corollary to that, of course, is levee management, which is unifunctional in purpose, and for the most part represents a last line defense. Now, for new high elevation storage reservoirs, there are a number of ecosystem and environmental benefits that we can accrue later on in the year. I want to emphasize to the subcommittee members back in DC that there are a number of benefits that we can accrue later on in the year. And I mentioned things like habitat protection flows. I mentioned things like side channel backwater pool replenishment. I mentioned things such as fish attraction flows, which, as you all are aware, very, very important for returning adult spawners. pulse flows for water quality, which is very, very important in estuaries where salinity intrusion is an issue, as well as the dilution potential that has significant benefits for the many thousands of MPDS and waste discharge requirements that are currently in existence today. Significantly, from a water supply or water contractor purveyor perspective, new high elevation storage can provide operational flexibility to those jurisdictions that happen to enjoy joint state-federal operations, like California, the CBP, the SWP. New yield generating those high elevation storage reservoirs, Mr. Chairman, can also provide additional long-term supply sustainability and resiliency for local purveyors, and also help support and augment those water purveyors who happen to benefit from a robust and active water transfer market for the last 10, 15, 20 years. Now, from a endangered species perspective, high elevation storage combined with coordinated operations within systems can also indirectly generate additional reservoir cold water pool assets, which I think the entire council is very familiar and can accept. It's very, very important for downstream in-stream thermal management. So such things as the aggressive temperature-related actions that are associated with things such as NOAA's biological opinions on the long-term CDP OCAP, we can provide with additional yield the ability to enhance compliance with many of those temperature targets downstream. From a climate change perspective, new dams can provide, as many studies are now demonstrating, and I want to drive this point home to the subcommittee members, an effective climate change adaptation, because dams provide that attenuation capability of that flood peak for additional runoff that's occurring earlier in the year as brought about by either warming temperatures or a change in precipitation form. So, Mr. Chairman, such things as watershed unit hydrographs, the interannual yield differentials that we experience between water years, even such things as extreme event probabilities can each be accommodated in certain degrees by new high elevation storage. Now, one of the questions that I sort of posed as a self-imposed question to the committee members was, in my view, are new storage reservoirs and facilities even possible given today's contemporary regulatory framework? And I usually flip that around with my own question, saying, okay, we have a watershed in question. The first question I ask as a hydrologist is, does that reservoir in any given water year experience either A, surplus flows, B, uncontrolled releases? We all know that in the western and mountain states, that answer, because of the snow-dominated hydrologic reality of those watersheds, that answer is yes. So it is that uncaptured yield that I want to serve as the foundational basis to help rationalize and justify new storage development, again, across the western and mountain states. Because, Mr. Chairman, if the hydrologic answer to that question is yes, then our responsibility as water resource managers and water experts and water practitioners means that we are compelled to develop and support a regulatory framework that actually can meet that hydrologic truism. I concluded my testimony before the committee, Mr. Chairman, by recognizing that there are a number of additional challenges that lay ahead. Clearly, many of them are regulatorily driven. In my experience in developing storage across California, I've never seen a more pressing need for new storage. I think I'm quite optimistic sitting here today in 2013, because I do see a lot of new factors and you see a lot of the stars lining up in favor of new storage that we perhaps haven't experienced in the past several decades. We have pressing needs for long-term supply security and resiliency. We have pressing needs for in-stream habitat protection. We have pressing needs for downstream flood control. We have pressing needs for downstream water quality control, including protection against saline intrusion brought about by things such as sea level rise. We have a need for clean energy. We have a strong need for upstream source area watershed protection because of the effects of climatic forcings. New storage reservoirs, high elevation reservoirs, Mr. Chairman, can provide a very, very effective platform to help solve that yield differential in many of the western and mountain states. Now, Mr. Chairman, I think it boils down to a question of overall integration. We've talked about some of the several facets that are associated or involved with things such as system operations, the need to use force-updated climate hydrology, the need for new regulatory adaptations. All of these factors, in my view, have to be integrated. They can't be dealt with in isolation. But if they are integrated, Mr. Chairman, then they can maximize our ability to implement effective and efficient long-term water supply storage development projects. There's no secret in my mind that storage in and of itself is not the panacea. And you know me long enough to know that for anyone hearing that coming from me as a long-time storage advocate, they're probably thinking, why in the world is he saying that? But that is a truism. Storage, in and of itself, is not the exclusive solution. It has to be integrated with other prescriptions. Now, what I wanted to emphasize to the congressional representatives is, having said that, storage has to be the starting point. And there's a number of reasons for that. We expend a considerable amount of time and resources in integrated water resource management planning. Some of those will come into question because we're sitting there with a static post on infrastructure. It was developed 50 to 100 years ago. There's no question about that. At the time, those storage facilities were developed based on a series of assumptions. Demands of the day, population projections of the day, regulatory framework of the day. We all know that that has migrated over the last 50 to 100 years. So we're over here. Accelerated climate change and its effects on baseline hydrology has only accelerated that gap, Mr. Chairman. So we're sitting here today as practitioners and water policy experts, as the council members are. We have two options. Number one, regulatory transition to move the gap or reduce that gap from this side, or take the other gap reduction from the infrastructure side. Because unless we do that, Mr. Chairman, then the gap is growing, and our best efforts at trying to meet some of the co-equal and multiple use or multiple public trust objectives that we've been struggling with for the past several decades, we won't stand a chance of doing that. So I guess what I want to just leave you with is some of the not special, but some of the specific concept initiatives that we're developing together with the full committee, Doc Hastings' committee, as well as McClintock Subcommittee on Water and Power. There are a couple of things that we want to bring forward that we think are going to help support some of the new technical aspects of legislative initiatives as we move forward and hopefully gains traction in 2014. And I'll just mention just four of them really quickly and conclude. Number one, what we want to do is we want to look very, very significantly at finally closing the flood control and water supply gap by reestablishing the new net system yield in California because of new storage. That's number one. Number two, we want to integrate in-stream and unimpaired flow objectives, again, under the projected enhancement brought about by new storage. This is going to be very, very important for the State Water Resources Board as they continue to implement phases 2, 3, and 4 in their statewide program on in-stream flow objectives. Number three, and you may be aware of this, Mr. Chairman, what I'm working on is a new climate-sensitized regulatory framework that harkens back to some of the discussions we had about identifying some of the significant risks associated with shifted climate and what it means to our long-standing regulatory approvals that have been there for a long time. So ultimately what we want to do, new system, yield comes in with new storage. How are many of those long-standing water right, or not water right necessarily, but water-related approvals, like pre-14 water rights, how are they even going to be adjusted under climate change? No one has addressed that in the state of California to this date, and that is a very, very egregious problem that we're going to face down the road. There has to be that gap between regulatory compliance instruments in place and what the physical hydrology is offering. Finally, number four, Mr. Chairman, and just to conclude, the fourth edition I'm working on very, very strongly, and this is probably the most important point that I wanted the subcommittee members to realize, and all the congressional representatives, is I want to encourage a strong and robust encouragement for private sector investors to jump into the fray on new storage development. We have to have a third party.
Do you think Mr. Fiorini's approach is a way to do that?
I think Vice Chairman Fiorini has some excellent points here on refocusing on small projects. Yeah. And my point here is...
How about on the cost share, 50-50?
Yeah.
In politics, the business is to demand that something be done with, and by implication saying somebody else should pay for it, which has partially led to the dilemma we're in.
Right. And I guess the final point, Mr. Chairman, just before we have to get your questions, so we have some, is that, and I believe fully with what Vice Chairman Fiorini was talking about, it's time to look at that third option. We've had state-funded projects, federal-funded projects. They're not going anywhere necessarily because some of the financial constraints. Let's look at the private equity market that we're talking to every single day. They're waiting and waiting and waiting. The first question they come up with is, how many projects have actually gone through ESA, NEPA? You got your permits? No, we don't. They're waiting to sign that check. Now, what I'm strongly believing is that some of these projects should be focused on a smaller basis, smaller level. Number one, they are more flexible. They're easier to finance, and they could benefit from more site-suitable advantages on the suite of benefits that we can ultimately implement. What's the bottom line in the end, Mr. Chairman, if we have 25 small regional projects that we can develop in 7 years versus waiting 20, 25 years to finally get the appropriate funding to develop our major state and federal projects? And I leave that as my concluding remarks, thanking you, Mr. Chairman, for your time. And
for question.
Yeah.
This sounds like a terrific program. I mean, it makes all kinds of sense. But in light of this dramatic subsidence issue in the Central Valley, are you making choices here in lieu of groundwater storage as opposed to surface storage, or how does that impact that issue, which affects large swaths of the Central Valley? Given limited resources, are you going to have some difficulties trying to sell this to the folks at land sinking the?
Well, I think when I use the term high elevation storage or storage, I think I want to put some semi or triple quotes around it. I think we all agree here. We've been wrestling with this issue for a long time. Storage in California, regardless of whether it's on stream, surface, off stream, subsurface, we need yield retention, and that's the focus. Whatever we have in surplus, whether we keep it in the ground, whether we keep it in an off-stream storage reservoir, we keep it in a surface reservoir, because that fourth storage reservoir that we've enjoyed for the last 100 years, called the snowpack, will no longer exist 10, 15, 20, 25 years.
But are you making choices between surface and groundwater, or can they live side by side? Is there a priority here? What is the priority?
Council member, I don't think that I'm making any specific prioritization. A lot of it comes down to revenue and the cost benefit. In the new high elevation storage projects, because of the topographic differential, one of the big ways of subsidizing and get private sector interest quite intrigued about high elevation surface storage projects is because of hydropower revenues. We got to sort of look at the entire suite. Where can I develop the highest revenue return for these storage projects? Hydropower is clearly a major revenue stream, as is water supply, as is transfer water, as is environmental flow benefits that you can integrate into a revenue stream. Hopefully I'm answering your question. I'm not looking at one specific storage site or storage element as the be-all and end-all. We need, as Californians, essentially the bottom line is that we have surplus yield that we funnel out to the Pacific Ocean every year. And that's almost, Mr. Chairman, could be a public trust wastage for 4 or 5 months.
Trust me, the public trust doctrine probably does not agree with that conclusion,
Probably
Mr.
doesn't.
Shibutani, but that's not relevant because storage is a tool. It's a tool now.
It's a tool.
It has to continue to be a
Right.
tool. It can help meet a bunch of problems, but it's not, as you point out, it's not the miracle solution that once you do creates endless amounts of new water never before discovered in the history of the world.
True.
Yeah.
And I guess my only...
So it's a very important management tool.
Yeah, and I guess just as a closing remark from my perspective, as a hydrologist, I look at any jurisdiction, and if there is ever a flood control issue and a water supply issue in the same water year, that is a hydrologic impossibility. You can't have that. I've looked at California's situation every single year. We're under strict reservoir re-op rules January, February, March, but for shortages, table A shortage allocations 4 or 5 months later. You look at that as a pure hydrologist on a mass balance perspective, and you think, 13 years into the new millennium and we haven't figured that out yet. That's the gap that I think it's incumbent upon us to close.
Okay. Mr. Santoyo.
Actually,
I'm sorry.
Dr.
Chair,
do you mind if I just had a
Yeah.
question to that? First of all, Dr. Shibutani, I really enjoyed the presentation. And I couldn't help, from your description, thinking of the analogy that we're facing with restoration. You've got big restoration, small restoration, and it's very hard for some of the smaller projects to be conducted at the same standard. So you spoke very eloquently about a systems approach, understanding how the various projects are connected. Could you comment a little bit about, so a small private project comes online, are the tools and resources for that smaller group to understand how it fits into the system, or is that something that we should also be considering, in the coming years, of having some sort of shared analysis, shared models in a way that enables the smaller groups to access the same level of technology that perhaps a very large project would have.
Councilmember, I love that comment, and I've been a strong advocate of trying to sort of uniform the actual informational database that's available to all projects, regardless of size. I think one of the issues of why some of these issues and projects take such a long time is because each individual proponent, depending on the agencies that are supporting them, we still operate in somewhat of a silo framework when it comes to information protection. Information, I don't believe, in California, even in the state, is really equitably shared completely transparently across all agencies. So, to try to answer your question, the resources are there. A smaller entity, depending on its finance or financing motivation, they're going to look at what their bottom line thresholds are, what benefits they can bring to the table. If the first question really is, does it pass the red face test on the cost benefit, the financiers are going to be the ones that are going to decide, what tools are available for them to present to their investors or their shareholders. Of course, the minimum threshold will be to meet all existing environmental compliance requirements. But I think there's a strong opportunity for these new storage projects. And again, I certainly support my colleague, Vice Chairman Fiorini, on what he was talking about in terms of, I do believe there's more flexibility in smaller projects, just on the basis of site selection. We all familiar with the American River watershed, and the first question I get is, can you build a major watershed or new facility in the American River watershed? All the best sites are taken. 4 or 5 years ago, we did a study. We identified 30 sites in the American River watershed for possible new storage. There are sites out there, but they're not the behemoths of the past. There are a lot of very innovative, smaller reservoirs that could accrue significant revenue and local agency or local community benefits with all those secondary and tertiary economic benefits that have spin-offs with new reservoir projects. So I hope that answered your question.
Mr. Knopf.
To some degree.
Dr. Shibutani, have you looked at the effectiveness or the potential effectiveness of vegetation management to increase the snowpack deposition and reduce sublimation of water, even in the context of a long-term trend of warming and reduction in the snowpack?
Yeah, Chris, that's an interesting question. I think I haven't done a lot of work on that. I know that my colleagues, Jay Lund and Roger Bales with the Sierra Nevada Research, they're probably more apt and certainly would be more knowledgeable to talk about those kinds of things. I mean, these are the things and these are the issues that are certainly emerging. The science is not stopping, which is what I really enjoy about this. It almost goes faster than what our policy decisions end up being. But there's no dearth of information, or there's no paucity of that kind of information that certainly experts like Jay and others are aware of. It's just a question of, do we finalize it? Do we get to a point where we can actually convey that to policy experts?
Dr. Lund is in back and twitching as you speak, I noticed. Whatever that means. Patrick.
Have you looked at other watersheds like the Tuolumne?
Yes, we're in discussions with some of the board of supervisors who, as you're probably aware, have reconstituted the long dormant Tuolumne County Water Agency down in that district. It's not just limited to the Sierras or the Southern Cascades. We just started another project to look at new storage enhancement out of all places in the Carmel River watershed, which is almost like ground zero for environmental sensitivity. But, this is just another reinforcing fact that new reservoirs and what people are thinking about in terms of yield and what we need for a variety of multi-purposes is very, very important. I don't think geographic limitation necessarily has to be the penultimate constraint, as we move forward to address a statewide issue.
Okay.